funds technology, open source technology that's to do with human rights. And I also am part of the ethicalsource.dev advisory team. You might know these folks from the Contributor Covenant. They have created various code of conducts for open source projects, as well as a new license for open source projects, which is an ethical do no harm license. So if you wanted software to not be used for harmful activities, then they are pushing for a license, that open source license. You can find out a little bit more about me on my website. It's on the screen at the moment, which is http eroldoesdesign.github.io. But I guess I've worked across, until I get the go-ahead to start the presentation proper, I've worked in a lot of different open source organizations. I worked in a Kenyan organization that was doing data collection, that had an open source data collection platform called Ushahidi. I worked there as there were two lead designers. I was one of them, and I had a colleague for 2 years. And then I worked at the Open Home Foundation. I've worked on Civi CRM, open source. I worked on lots of different open source projects while I was one of the senior designers at Superbloom Design, from projects that are like to do with open source private messaging, emailing, and gosh, what else did we work on? Just a lot of different open source projects, the design for that. And yeah, now I have recently joined the Open Home Foundation, which creates open source software around smart home automation. So you're talking, we're talking like all of the kind of smart technology that you can possibly have in a home. So both the open source software for that, and as well as that, the open source hardware. So I now am working on products that have hardware associated with them. But yeah, if you want me to start, let me know the rest of the presentation, or if people have questions while we're still waiting for people to join, then I'm happy to take some questions and just chit chat before I start.
Yeah, I think you can start already, right? You can start already.
Okay. Okay, great. I dropped the link to the slides on Canva in the chat. They should have open access for commenting, so you should be able to comment on those slides if you do have questions, or if you need anything clarified about what I'm going to talk about. But I'm going to talk about, so I've got, the title is Designing for Open Communities, the Designer's Role in Sustainable Teams. There's 3 focuses of this talk, which is what I was asked to talk, I was suggested three wonderful topics to talk about. So I've tried to cover all of them. We have the designer's role in cross-functional open source teams, humanitarian-centered design, so bringing empathy into open source projects, and the alternatives that are humanitarian or human rights-based in the open source world to get involved in, that might not be your typical open source projects that people tend to think about when they think about open source. And then design systems for open communities, and some strategies on how to build and maintain design systems and work across a broad UI UX product in the open source space. I don't know how you all do questions during these sessions, but I'm quite happy to receive questions as I talk through the chat, and I'll try and address them as they come in. So don't be afraid to ask me questions as I talk. If I don't get to them immediately, I can cover them towards the end. But yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions, or if anything seems unclear and you want me to explain something again, please do let me know. So I've already, I see a hand raised. What, should we take that? Oh, it is, okay, go for it. I see the hand raised again.
Okay, all right, for it not to disturb the class, just look it now. Maybe the other questions will come after, but you can take these ones now so that they will not distract you.
Sure.
Right. Yeah, Chinedu, go on with your question.
Okay, thank you very much. So I just joined a couple minutes ago. I don't know if you have covered it, but I wanted to ask in plain terms, what is open source system or open source? Like what's the idea in basic terms?
The basic terms of what open source is?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's a good thing to cover as well. So I would encourage you to do some internet searches on what is open source. You'll get different information depending on the different websites that you go to. Wikipedia probably has a pretty good entry there, but you also might want to take a look at how places like the Linux Foundation define open source and the Open Source Initiative and other places define open source. But open source software, so OSS, which can also be described as FOSS, and F stands for free. So you might find it being called OSS or FOSS, and the F just stands for free and open source software. So in a basic sense, open source software is freely accessible. So you don't have to pay money you don't have to pay any money to use the software. So it's freely downloadable, freely accessible, but it's also not illegal. So it's legally free, if that makes sense. So people have made it free because they believe that software should be able to be used by everyone. And the open source part, open source basically just, it means that it is transparent and open and viewable. And in a lot of ways, it means that the code, so how the software has been coded, is you can access that code. So basically, if you have some software on your computer, you might not know what the code looks like. But for something to be open source software, you have to be able to see and access that code, and also in some cases be able to modify that code. So change the code, add something extra to the code, or like edit the code in some way. So if we take like a basic application, let's say like a calculator that can be on a mobile phone device, or it can be on a computer. Calculators kind of come as standard on a computer. But if you could see the code, and if you could change the code to say, also make that calculator a stopwatch to track time and make alarms. So say you wrote a piece of code that set alarms and added it to the calculator. If you could do that, then that calculator would be open source software, because it's the code is open, so you could add your bit of code to it and make it different, better, or however you want to define it. It's just basically something that you can add to and modify as far as software goes. Okay, I see a thumbs up. It's good to define open source software though, because I'm going to go into some topics which may be a little bit detailed about open source software. So thank you for the question. Really important. So let's talk about the designer's role in cross-functional open source teams. So people build open source software. Lots of different people build open source software. It can be a team of one building an open source software. It can be a team of, where I work at the moment, we have 60 employees, people that are paid to work on the open source software. I'd actually really like to know if folks can say in the chat how you define yourself. Do you define yourself as designers? Do you define yourself as like a little bit of a coder, project managers? How would you define like your skills, or how you want to do what you would do professionally? That would be really interesting to find out from the people here. It's because we're going to be talking a lot about the design aspects of things. But generally, okay, we've got a UX designer. Great. Generally, designers, as will be familiar to people that identify as designers here, we're a bridge between users and software. So the people that use technology and tools, and the people that make the technology and tools. So we make sure that anything that wants to be built technology-wise meets the needs of the people that are going to be using and operating the tool. So designers might create UI designs, they might create UX designs, they might create graphic design, but really what they're trying to do is translate the user needs, or what a person using the software needs, into and deliver that to the people that are going to write the code and build the software. And commercial designers, so the difference, there's open source and there's commercial software. So the commercial proprietary software, as probably some of the folks that identify as web developers and kind of coders might be familiar with these terms, which are commercial proprietary, which is basically software and technology that you pay money for, and then open source software, which is free and openly accessible. There's lots of different job roles for designers in commercial proprietary, and there's lots of new roles being added and removed as new technologies and new processes appear in the commercial space for technology. So an old version of a job title back in the early 2000s might be a web designer, which is quite an old job role term. And a newer term for a web designer now is a digital designer or a digital product designer. So things change quite a lot in the commercial proprietary world, but also the commercial proprietary world is well established, and it understands the value of design really well, because design is a critical part of how technology gets built and how it gets sold. So if you're not designing your technology well and you're trying to sell it to people, then people aren't going to buy it. So you might have a question in your mind now, well, why would anyone use open source software instead of why would people use open source software if it's not thinking about users? Or why would people buy commercial software if they could use free software as well? So there's different arguments for people that might prefer commercial software or proprietary software or open source software. But one of the biggest differences between proprietary commercial software, so software that you have to pay for, and open source software is open source software isn't very familiar with the process of design. Yeah, so there aren't that many designers that are paid to do work in open source software, and there aren't that many designers doing contributions. So free voluntary work for open source software, which is a lot of what open source software is. It's a lot of people making their own projects, coders making their own projects that help them or help other people. So very little of open source software is actually has a lot of like infrastructure around company employees around it. So designers in proprietary commercial spaces, they're typically there to increase revenue, so get people to buy more of the software or technology, or make sure that users can do what they want to do and that the company wants them to do. So in open source software, it's a little different because we're not selling the commercial software, right? It's free and openly available. So again, what does a designer do in open source software if it's not to try and make sure that the software is better than another competitor in order to sell more of it? So it's a little bit different in open source software. We don't tend to measure success by revenue or money coming in, because open source software, even though there are open source software organizations that rely on donations or grants, or they're nonprofits, or even my organization that makes hardware, we support the organization by selling the hardware. You can't give away hardware for free. You can give away software for free because it's a digital item as opposed to a physical, real components. There are some organizations which have got money coming in order to hire staff and keep an open source software maintained and growing. But open source software's success is more often measured by how many users are using the open source software, or using the open source software as a dependency, depending on what the open source software is. And a dependency means that one piece of software relies on another piece of software in order to work correctly, in a very basic way of describing dependencies. So it also is measured by how useful and well an open source software solves a specific problem that for a user. This might not be lots of users. So open source software might not have as many users as a commercial alternative, but there are lots of reasons why users do choose to use open source software, not always just because it's free, but also sometimes it's really the only option, or it's better than the commercial or paid for option. And success for open source software is also defined by how actively the open source software project is maintained and contributed to by both the creators and the maintainers and the wider community of open source software. So success for open source software, it isn't about designers making features that people want to pay for, making something, a technology tool that people want to pay for more, because there's no or very little, not very often, money exchanged by users to the creators. But open source software, especially the pieces of open source software that are critical infrastructure. So these are like the foundations of the internet, the foundations of the open web. Lots of people rely on these pieces of open source software. You may or may not know how critical open source software really is to even just using technology tools, using devices. You can look up how much like open source software is used even on the devices that you may have paid money for. So a lot of mobile phones that even you would have to pay for have a lot of open source software in them. And it needs to stay secure. It needs to stay, open source software needs to stay secure, it needs to stay usable, and it needs to stay maintained and preferably openly licensed. So one of these things, usability, is a very important thing that designers do, as well as like many of these other things. Like designers can also contribute into making sure that the open source software stays secure and maintained and also open by doing their work openly as well. So what do the designers do in these open source software projects, or what can they do? Lots of kinds of design is fairly new, like I said, to open source software projects. So UI, UX, product design, user research, usability, design systems, branding, etc. They're all quite new to open source software. Even the very large organizations in open source software that has been established for a long time. Names like Linux might be familiar to some of you. Canonical's Ubuntu operating system. Mozilla runs the Firefox browser, and also Thunderbird, another email piece of software that you can look at emails through. There's things like Ruby Gems. There's things like Django, which I believe is a programming language. Jupyter Labs, which is a piece of software that scientists and academics use. And there's lots of other open source software. But a lot of these open source software don't have designers involved very much. And they are required often to play multiple roles. So if we went back to commercial designers, most of these commercial designers have a single role that they're doing. They're either the product designer, UX designer, UI designer, and maybe they have many colleagues working on the aspects of design for paid for technology. But in open source, you often have to be a product manager, UX designer, UI designer, a bit of a graphic designer, or you can be if you want to be. So there's lots of multiple roles that you play in open source software. So as a designer wanting to contribute to open source software, or if you're interested in how designers get involved in open source software, you should be prepared to do a few different things before you start contributing, or even if you've contributed before. It's good to define these things. So it's good to clearly define what your skills and capabilities are and interests are in open source software. So what are your design skills, or what are your coding skills if you do have them, what your capabilities and what you want to learn are, what your interests are in open source software. You should be prepared to manage your own tasks and workload and be your own product manager. So very rarely, if a tool or open source project is going to have a dedicated product manager or somebody that is guiding the strategy of an open source software project, it's often the strategy is often set by the coders that created the project. So really, as a designer, you're not really going to be told by anybody in the project what you should or shouldn't be doing. It's up to you to discover what the priorities of the project are, or to help the rest of the people involved in the project figure out what the priorities are from users. Open source software tends to work on like a bugs first, typically, which isn't necessarily very useful for designers, because often bugs aren't to do with bugs are usually problems in the code, even though some bugs can be usability bugs or UI bugs. But yeah, the finding ways to improve the open source software as a designer, very few open source software projects are going to be able to clearly define, oh, we need a designer to do this, or we need a designer to do this. You're going to have to be prepared to look at the open source software and help them figure that out. You're going to need to work openly and transparently and find hacks away closed design tools and systems and software. So a lot of design software that we have are closed and proprietary. So an example of a closed proprietary design software is actually Figma, or Adobe products, or even Canva. They're closed proprietary tools, because even though you might be able to use them for free in some ways, like free trials, you still can't see how they're built. You can't see the code of Canva. You can't see the code of Adobe, and you can't change it. It's not free and open source software. And actually, it's quite expensive to use, and it's not really a collaborative tool. So as a designer, you have to find ways around and hacks around using closed tools or paid for tools in order to work openly and transparently. And often that's just doing screenshots and making flat images of your designs to add into where the code is on like a GitHub or other repository website. That's the basic way of finding the hack around, but there are other ways to hack around proprietary design software. And you should also be clear on how long you can stay contributing and don't ghost an open source software project. So lots of open source software projects are really interested in designers helping out and helping them to improve the design and usability of open source software. But then designers sort of say that they are interested in helping, but they don't let the projects know how long they can help for and what they want to help with before leaving or disappearing. So it's always a good idea to make sure that you can tell the open source software project that you're interested in helping, what your abilities for time dedication are. So I've added a lot of different tasks into this talk. So I really want you all to spend some time defining your skills and your interests in open source software. So for those of you that have already participated in open source software, this might be a little easier for you than others that haven't considered it. But an example here of a bad statement from a designer is if a designer comes along to either me or an open source project and says, I'm looking to contribute as a designer and interested in any tasks for open source software, it might be nice. Oh, you're interested in any tasks. Okay, but this tells me that a designer doesn't really know what they're good at or what they want to develop as a skill and what they think the open source software needs. It basically tells me that the designer hasn't really thought critically or carefully about what they really want to do for the open source software. And so often the reason that these statements don't go very well in open source software when designers want to contribute is because the developers and the maintainers keeping the open source software updated don't really have time or often the interest in design to really figure out what kind of design that you are good at as a designer and what you like to do. You have to tell them. So somebody that identifies as a backend, server database developer or some kind of coder doesn't have the interest or the time unless you start to talk to them about it. About design skills or design tasks and what is possible. So you really have to help them understand what your skills are and what your competencies are. You also have to show some interest in the open source software topic. So you can say things like, I'm a user of Firefox browser, or I use Fedora Linux's operating system on my laptop, and I want to help these projects because I've used them or I've heard of them. There are other projects as well. There's projects to do with music. There's projects to do with languages. There's projects to do with food. There's projects to do with human rights and humanitarian cases. Pretty much any subject that you could be interested in as a hobby, there's going to be some kind of open source software project that does something for that kind of hobby. So if you're really into music, you might be interested in contributing to an open source software music system. So I currently work on at my job that I've just joined, I work on an open source music tool that's an alternative to Spotify and Tidal and all the places where you can listen to music online, but it's open source. So that means it's free, and it means that you can see the code, and it's all about music. So yeah. Anything that you can be interested in, but it's good to come with an interest and an understanding of what you want to do. So a good example, alternatively here is, I'm looking to contribute to open source software for the first time. I use Thunderbird email client and Firefox browser, and I'm new to using things like GitHub and GitLab repositories. I don't want to write any code. I want to practice and grow my skills as a UI designer, and I'd like to start by doing a UI assessment of an open source software project and look at improving the accessibility in the most used area of the open source software. I plan on spending my evenings and weekends helping for around 10 hours per month. So this is a much better version of the other statement, which is, I just want to help out with anything. Here, the people maintaining the open source project really know what you want to do, what you're going to start with, how much time you can dedicate, and what kinds of things you use. So you might not be contacting Thunderbird or Firefox to help out, but it gives them a good understanding of the kinds of projects that you use if you do say, these are the open source software projects I use or I'm interested in. So this is specific and helpful, and it guides the open source software project in your skills and time, and it also helps build their understanding and competency of design and design skills. So alternatively, I see that there's a few folks in the chat that define themselves as front-end developers and web innovators, so possibly on the more coding side of things. So if you flip this around in the sense, oh yeah, sure, the link isn't working. Interesting. I don't have a PDF version, but let me see if I can make a shortened link. I'll do that real quickly. I'll do that as I ask you to take on a task, if that's okay. So I'll just finish what I was saying. If you're a coder or identify as a developer, think about the kinds of information that you would find useful from designers. Hey, I'm looking for a designer that can look at our branding to improve our branding so that more users can better identify our open source software or our tool out of the other options available. So you can flip this task around and start to figure out what you want to ask designers for as well. So I'm going to ask you all to do an exercise on the screen at the moment, and I'll paste this in the chat as well. I've got a template. So for you all to fill out. So if you're a designer, you can fill out the following template and add, you can add this to either your GitHub profile if you do have one, or you can add it to anywhere where you're keeping a track of how you're defining your skills. So here's the template for designers in the chat. So you can copy paste that in and fill in the gaps. And then if you're a developer, you can do this template, because I thought we might have some developers in the chat in the session this evening as well. And it's really just like two alternatives. One's the designer defining what they can do, and the other is the developer asking for what kind of design that they might want help with. And so I'd like you to spend a little bit of time, let's say like the next 5 minutes, filling out this template and having a think about what your statement is as designers for contributing to open source software. And don't worry if you don't know any open source software projects to begin with, or you can do a search to see what you might be interested in filling in, but you can also describe the kinds of projects that you might want to work on. So again, think about the kinds of hobbies or interests that you have. And then you can say you're interested in open source software that looks at languages or looks at helping people or something like that. But let's give it 5 minutes for you all to fill this in. And then I'd love for people to share in the chat when you're done your statements. That would be great. And let me make a short link for this presentation. I hope Bitly is an okay link shortener for you all. If I make a PDF as well, that should be smaller. Okay, we've got a PDF. Amazing. Thank you for putting your template in the chat. I really appreciate it. Sometimes when you make exercises in a presentation and you ask the listeners to do exercises, sometimes you wonder whether they do them. And it's lovely to see evidence when people do them. So thank you. I do really appreciate that you went ahead and did it. Here is a link to a PDF version of the slides. It should be a little easier to load for people following along. We'll give it another couple of minutes and see whether anybody else has any filled out templates. Oh, do you know what I love about your statement as well? Is you said you can spend 1 hour a day to help the designer understand open source software. So this is a part of open source software that a lot of designers really need from developers. So for the developers listening here, if you can ever offer time with a designer to help understand what the open source software is trying to do, how it functions, you know, if it's running in a Docker image, then show them briefly like how to set up Docker or how to set up a local host version. A lot of the times designers aren't really starting off with these skills in order to see the open source software. So some of the things that you can do as developers to really help designers to contribute to open source software is just spending that little bit of time showing them the open source software. The meaning of open source software. So I did talk about that right at the beginning, but the meaning of open source software is it's basically software that is free and open. So you can modify the code, you can see the code, as opposed to software that you have to pay for and that you cannot see the code. So open source software, probably a famous example of open source software is maybe Ubuntu, the operating system, versus Windows, which is a operating system that you have to pay for. You don't have to pay for Ubuntu's operating system. Ubuntu's operating system you can download for free online, I believe, or other operating systems are also available. But the basic difference of the basic meaning of open source software is that it's free, openly transparent, openly viewable, so you can see how it was coded. And yeah, it's usually created by volunteers and not companies. So it's not commercially motivated. It's usually for some kind of common good. Another somewhat famous example of open source software is the Firefox browser. I'm not sure what browsers people are using, but Firefox is an open source software. And Mozilla create a lot of open source software, the people that create Firefox. Also, something that other designers in the room might recognize as open source is some fonts that you may use are open source licensed fonts. So it means that you can use the fonts for free. So for the designers in the room, maybe you are familiar with for example, a font called Open Sans. So Open Sans, in its name, is open, and it's openly licensed. So you can, in the license section of that webpage, the Google Fonts webpage, you can see that the font software is licensed under, in fact, I'll just share this on my screen, actually. Let's see, where is that? There we go. This font software is licensed under the SLIL Open Font license. So this means that you can download it for free, and there's an open font license. So this means that this is the reason why a lot of fonts are free to use, because they're open source. But it's not something that we commonly know. But yeah, other things might be Mozilla's tools, so Firefox browser. So you might be familiar with this icon here. Other open source software that you might be familiar with is things like Bitcoin.design. A lot of Bitcoin wallets are open source. The Bitcoin.design team do a lot of open source design work on Bitcoin wallets. So if you use any crypto wallets or Web3 projects, a lot of those, also the Ethereum are creating open source. A lot of blockchain is open source. I feel Microsoft Google Docs private site back to Open Docs. I mean, yeah, that sounds like a reasonable opinion, definitely. A lot of commercial software, actually, to that point, a lot of commercial software does look to open source software, and kind of there's a lot of argument or discussion online about how much commercial paid for software relies on open source software, and how essentially a lot of the things that we do pay for technology wise wouldn't exist if there wasn't open source software. But they also privatize, essentially. They take these open versions and they basically, slap a logo on it and put a price tag on it and tell you it's better than the open source version. And it's not always better than the open source version. That's kind of an opinion. But thank you again for putting your template in the chat. I really appreciate it. Oh, community, you have experience as community management for Web3 communities, amazing. So maybe the Bitcoin.design team would be interesting to you, working on a wallets, or maybe even some of the projects in Ethereum. But yeah, okay, let's move on because I'm aware of time. So in rare cases, open source software has created design tasks. So more often than not, you're not going to find, when you find an open source software project that you want to contribute to or that you're interested in, you're not going to find these tasks. Often you're going to have to find the tasks and define the tasks yourself. But there are sometimes, in rare cases, design tasks. So opensourcedesign.net maintains a jobs board for both unpaid and paid tasks in open source software. And again, I'm just going to open up that URL, open source, so that you can see the jobs board that we maintain here. So you can see here, there's a number of different open source software projects. Some of them are offering payment, some of them that are gratis are looking for volunteers. But there are projects that are looking for logos, there's projects that are looking for children's book illustrations, there's UI UX work, branding work, and lots of other projects, open source software projects that are looking for help from designers. So that's one place where you can find tasks for designers, is in the open source design jobs board. But you've also got projects like Signal is a messenger app, and they collect UX feedback in a forum post. So you have to create a account to go on the Signal signal.org forum post, but they talk about the UX needs for Signal there. Thunderbird, which is an email software for viewing emails, have a UX group, so they talk about the kind of UX help that they need there. And then, of course, we just looked at the open source design.net jobs board. So if you haven't already, we've shared the statements in the chat actually, so we'll move on from that. But here's an example of when you might find a project on, say, GitHub, and what you would want to be looking for to find design tasks. So here we have a couple of the project's interfaces. Here I went on the Django project here, and I found that they have a task for a website redesign here. And the way that I found that task is, after I found the Django project, I went into the issues section here, and then I looked in the labels section of their project, and I saw that they had two labels that I could select, one for user research and one for UX. And here this task came up about redesigning their website. The same for another open source project called PyPI, which is a scientific, I believe PyPI is a scientific open source software. I'm not actually 100% sure what PyPI does, but they're looking for a lot of UI UX help. So they're looking for help with a UI on their admin section. They've got long project names and they want that better designed in a UI. They need some help with how people inspect links, hyperlinks in file details, different things about account management and a documentation badge design here. So they've got a lot of different projects when you filter for UI UX needs in the PyPI project. And so those are just like some examples of when you look in the issues section, or when you look on these projects, how you can find tasks if they've started to create tasks. But like I said, it's quite rare that open source projects have created these tasks. There's a couple of definitions here for people that aren't necessarily familiar with these. So the more of the coders in the room, we've got things like GUI or graphical user interface. In fact, the UI designers in the room might find the term GUI more frequently used in open source than the term UI. So user interfaces are often referred to as graphical user interfaces by developers in open source, mostly because a graphical user interface is a lot more, has more design elements in it than, say, a user interface which is perhaps used in, say, coding language command lines. So a user interface that isn't very graphical would be called a user interface. But just so you don't encounter this term and are unfamiliar with GUI versus UI, they're essentially the same thing. There's a couple of other terms here about low fidelity prototypes and WCAG. A lot of open source software projects are very, very happy to receive design contributions that improve their accessibility. So that's something that you can use as a resource to help define some tasks to better accessibility for open source software projects. This is a little bit nerdy, but I think if the designers in the room are familiar with the design maturity, there is a fairly famous diagram for designers on a website called Nielsen Norman, which does a lot of information and courses for designers, UI UX designers. And it talks about when you would know, thank you very much for your template in the chat. this stages of maturity defines how mature an organization is in terms of like how they implement UI and UX and design, but it doesn't really accurately capture the open source software maturity of UX and design. So I created my own diagram here for when open source software is looking at design. So when a open source software has no understanding of design, they think design is only visual elements, they think design is expensive, that design is done by designers and clients only, then that's kind of when it's misunderstood. And then they get more advanced, the better. They integrate design, so they advance in the scale once they write specific issues for designers and label them, and that design contributions are welcomed and spoken to when they have questions and needs and things like that. So most open source software are kind of around the -1 to #1. So design is pretty non-existent. You will find the rare case of open source software kind of being connected and they have some designers or they have an understanding of how useful design is. But this is a good chart for designers to use to, when you encounter an open source software, is to understand like where that open source software is in understanding their design knowledge and their design maturity. And it's also a good diagram for people making open source software if they want to try and assess their own understanding of design and where they see themselves on this scale, which is ideally people would be up in this higher area where design is integrated and regularly contributed and users are involved and that everything is going a lot more smoothly and a lot more collaboratively in open source. Sadly, I can't shorten this link because it's a Penpot link, but I'll drop it in the chat just in case people want to see it later on. We're going to move on to our second topic now, and in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we don't go too late because we've got, I believe, just another hour, and I want some time for questions. But we're going to talk a little bit about humanitarian-centered design and bringing empathy into open source projects. So as I talked about quite a lot in the first section, not a lot of open source projects have designers involved, which also means they don't have users involved, which often means that they don't really understand how other people other than themselves, the people that have coded and created the open source software projects, they don't really understand how other people are using their tools. And so empathizing with other users is quite rare in open source, other than through the method of logging bugs or adding bugs or problems, like saying, hey, I had this error. You'll find more commonly people will be saying, hey, this error happened in my open source software, rather than, hey, I use your open source software to do this, this, and this. So it's much more common to be error focused rather than experience focused and empathy focused. So that's something that designers can bring into projects, and especially useful in humanitarian and human rights related open source software. So we've talked a lot in the first section about how open source software is often created by and for developers and only for developers. And that's quite false, actually. Like it's there's a lot of that, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of open source software that's coding languages or technical tools or things for other developers to use. But there's a lot of other open source software which is for anyone to use, or should be for anyone to use. So here we say, here it says, most open source software are typically created by and for developers to scratch their own itches, or to solve a problem that they have themselves. And then the process of open sourcing is them offering what they've created as their own solution to another person that might have a similar problem. And creators of open source software, they rarely anticipate the users or ask the other users how they use their open source software. They tend to assume that other users are exactly like themselves or other power users. So what is a power user and what is an average kind of user in open source software? So a power user is typically a coder or a developer, they can read and modify the code. They both use the open source software, and they make contributions or modifications or pull requests for changes based on their own needs. So as I was saying at the beginning, if there's an open source software calculator app, a power user knows how to change the code and add a whole new aspect and feature to that open source software calculator app. An average user in open source software, they could be a coder or any other kind of person. They might be able to read the code and understand what coding language it is written in, or that it is coded, and they can access the code, but they cannot or will not modify it for whatever reasons that may be. And they only use the open source software if they have made non-code contributions or don't really get involved with deeply with how the code is modified. So this is typically how you would define. It's not 100% accurate across all different open source projects, but typically you have a lot of power users. You also do have a lot of average users, so just people using open source software, but that they don't get involved with the kind of modification aspects and the coding side of things. So when you're thinking about or wanting to grow empathy and understanding for all the different kinds of users, some of the best ways to do so are asking respectful questions to others and ask yourself, do I know what a specific user might want from this open source software? Can I imagine what they might feel? It's also good to read books about users or blogs or see talks or videos or social media or family and friends and being curious about how users use open source software. And then watching people trying to use the open source software and then asking them questions about what they're experiencing, which is user testing. So these are all really good ways that designers that are interested in improving open source software can ask any of the two kinds of users, really, how they do these things to better understand how the open source software is being used so that they might start to improve the design and usability of it. And to talk a little bit more specifically about specific open source software that is created for humanitarian purposes, for civic technology, they're called, there's this website called Digital Public Goods, and also you can find lots of projects which define themselves as civic technology in the open source software space, or civic tech open source software. So these are typically projects, especially the digital public goods, are, I believe, maintained maintained and kept running by the United Nations, and they are centered around sustainable development goals to improve life on Earth. So I don't know how familiar people are with the sustainable development goals, but there are things like making sure that there are sustainable cities and communities, peace and justice and strong institutions, zero hunger, no poverty, and quality education and things like that. And these are on the Digital Public Goods website, there are open source software projects that have different sustainable, can we say AI generated code? That's a really big question, actually. We'll get to that one at the end about the AI code. But yes, the sustainable development goals are listed on each of the open source software projects, but they're specifically focused on humanitarian and human rights related goals where empathetic design is critical, because most of the people using these open source software are not going to be your power users. Maybe the people that made them and keep them running are your power users, but most of the people that are using them are going to be your average users. So design is critical for all open source software. Even developers benefit from empathy and understanding in order to help their technical problems. So even if we're looking at a project like, say, if we go all the way back here, if we look at a project like Django, which is a coding language, or PyPI, which is a scientific open source software, even these people, the people that are power users of those technologies, they also need us to help design better for them and display empathy to help their technical problems. And how we can better promote empathetic design in open source software, we can start with the way that tasks and issues are written. So they're written typically, these tasks are written typically by developers with a technical focus. And as designers, one of the best things that we can do when we're introduced to an open source software project, if they haven't got design tasks already, is translate them into design challenges that lead with empathy. So we're gonna do an active exercise in a moment. So we're gonna do some proactive design. We're gonna take a look at this issue, and I'm gonna drop it in the chat in just a moment. We're gonna take a look at this issue. Actually, do you know what I'll do? I'll do this. And I'll just take a look at actually the Digital Public Goods website. So you can find the Digital Public Goods. If you go to Digital Public Goods and then registry, you can find all the different projects listed underneath that page of this website. And actually the project that we're going to take a look at is actually this first one listed here, which is Digital. But you can also filter by the country that created the Digital Public Goods open source software here. You can also look at what sustainable development goals they're focusing on, and what kind of you've got open AI systems for people interested in AI. But we're going to take a look at this one because this is the one that we've got here, and we can find their GitHub. We can actually find their GitHub where they keep the code listed on the Digital Public Goods website here. But I'm going to go ahead and paste this directly in here. So they've got an issue here, right? They've got the word design, so we know that it's for designers in some way because the word design is included. They want the design of a subscription info page, but here we've got not really very much information for a designer to go on as a task. We have a placeholder in the admin UI currently, and perhaps a URL of where to find it. And we want to decide what we show users on this page, and then there's no other information really here. There might be some other pieces of information we can find by following some of these links, but there's not a lot of information here. So one of the things that we can do in order to better understand this task and better describe this task is we can fill out a template that I have created, which is this one here. So let's take a look at this template. And I'll also drop it in the chat for people to use. So I created this when I was working at Superbloom, where you take an issue. So you take an issue to translate it. So you've got an issue here. You put the issue here. So please describe the problem from at least one user's point of view. So here we've got the problem of design a subscription info page. We need to describe that problem from a user point of view. What does a user need to do? And what do they need to create? So what part of this can we figure out from the information we have here, or thinking empathetically about what users might want to do on a subscription page for a tool which is about case management for the social sector and NGOs? How can we begin to translate that that task into a problem for a user's point of view? One way of technically achieving this could be for one user and what are their primary needs or actions, and another user and what are their primary needs and actions. So we've got, please describe the problem. Are there any technical ways that we understand how to solve the problems for different users? What is success for our users? How do they define success and accomplish goals? So what would the goals and success mean for somebody, a user, accessing a subscription info page? What are our design constraints? Do we have any understanding of what the constraints are? So does it have to be on this URL? What information does it have to contain? Where does it need to take people? So what are our constraints? How can this work be continued by others? And what are the next tasks that need completing? So here we have an essential part of open source here, which is very unusual for designers. The contribution that we might make to open source as the designers is finishing this template, and we might not actually have the time to continue this work, to actually do the design, say, for this subscription page. But what we want to make sure that another designer could clearly understand where we left off as a designer here from this template. So how can this work be continued? What are the next tasks that need completing? Well, maybe with a subscription page, maybe there's some information gathering that needs to happen. Maybe there's some understanding of what subscription means in this context. And then if you've done any sketches or diagrams as part of filling out this template, you can put them here. So maybe you could find images of subscription pages on the internet that you think are good and add those as examples. And so what this translation task does is it takes this minimal issue. As a designer, we've taken this issue that was written for a developer, really, but intended for a designer, and we've really expanded with empathy and understanding for users what this task needs to achieve. So you might ask yourself the questions. Let's do the presentation again. So you might ask yourself some questions like, as a new user with limited funding, how can I see ways in a subscription page to lower the cost so that I can do my case management for students in a remote village, And a second question you might ask yourself is, as a designer, is, will this subscription page load on low data on my older mobile? So these are the types of questions that when I'm looking at a issue, which is written for a developer, I'm translating it to a designer for either myself to fill out or another designer to fill out. I'm looking at these questions and I'm asking these questions for myself and I'm filling out information. So that's our template. So I don't think we've actually got time for this, but I've added the template in the chat. And what I'd really encourage you all to do is find an issue somewhere. It doesn't have to be a perfect issue for you to work on. In fact, you could use some of the examples from back here. So you could either go on the Django project and use this website design issue. You could go on PyPI and use some of these, or you could go through the Digital Public Goods website and find a project that you're interested in the Digital Public Goods and find an issue that they have written and take a look at the template and try and translate that issue that you find into this template as a designer. So if we had time today, we would do that right now, but I don't think we've really got time to do that task. So I'm going to leave that as homework. And then we're going to talk about design systems, but I'm going to pause for a second here. Does anyone have any questions, or do you understand what the template, the translation template is trying to do? Does this make sense as a design task? If you can pop in the chat yes or no. Okay, I see some yeses. Okay, cool. Designers, folks that say that they identify as designers, does this feel like something that you could fill out when you find an issue to help you better understand how to approach the issue and start to have a conversation with the project? Does this feel like a good template that you could potentially use? I hope that silence means yes. Okay, I'm going to move on. So we're going to move on to our last section here, which is about design systems for open communities and how to build and maintain those. So design systems are design systems actually have a number of different definitions across, if you ask different designers. Some designers will tell you it's about the design kit, design UI kit. So what UI framework does something use? Other designers will talk about how a design system is about everything to do with the visual language of a project, whatever project that is. And I think both of those are correct answers. They are both design systems. One of them is a little bit more extensive than the other one. So a design system that also includes branding or tone of voice documents is just a little bit more expanded than a design system which is just talking about, say, the user interface elements of a project. But both are design systems, in my opinion. So what design systems are really, really good for, especially in open source software, but also in the commercial world, is about avoiding building parts of your software that have been done before and multiple times before. So design systems are really, really good for making sure that you're not doing repetitive tasks and that you know the rules that you need to follow. And this is especially true of the UI kits within a design system. So one of the main reasons that coders and developers choose to use UI kits, in fact, I don't think many coders or developers are ever developing anything without using a UI kit now. But using a UI kit doesn't equal a design system that's extendable and flexible and understands like how things can be continued. So a UI kit is useful for not repeating or building new components, like the components are already built, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your design system has everything that it needs. And so this is kind of where often when open source software assumes, or any software assumes, that choosing a UI kit means that they won't need a designer to come and help. They often find themselves in need of a designer when they realize the UI kit doesn't have something that they actually need. If anyone knows any UI kits or has any UI kits that they use, please do pop them in the chat, because it's always interesting to learn about design kits and resources from other folks. But a design system, yeah, Material UI is a very popular one. Yep. That's a Google one, I believe. So Google created the Material UI. So a design system is extendable and flexible and adaptable for the future. So a UI kit is one component of a design system, or the beginning of a design system. Designers are often thinking about what's needed now as well as what's needed in the future for different platforms or screen sizes or user types. And typically in an open source project, an extended design system won't necessarily be thought of as needed in open source software, especially if a UI kit is like good enough. So often open source software projects are kind of hacking together from the basics of a UI kit, what they need, or say they might make choices on how to design open source software based off of what is possible in a UI kit. So say you wanted a screen that had a imagine that you had a screen that had scrollable images and also a series of buttons and also some form elements in there. If that UI kit didn't have one of those elements, so say it didn't have a way to do thumbnail images in that UI kit which was chosen, then often in open source software, the developers will choose to build that page differently based off of what is possible in the UI kit rather than what is needed by the users, is kind of what I'm trying to say. So in open source software, designers are really useful in these projects for assessing whether a UI kit meets the needs of users. So often I found in the work that I do that open source software developers and projects often just will choose a UI kit, but not really think about what the UI kit really needs to do and what they need to change about it and what the gaps are. So one of the really useful tasks that designers can do, or processes that designers can do to help out a project that already exists in an open source software project, is a process called heuristic evaluation. Open exercises and tasks using atomic design tasks like the interface inventory to catalog and build out a design system in a tool like Penpal. So, and then right at the end, we're just going to really briefly talk about design tokens and building design systems along the front end system. But what works for what we need for users around components to choose. So when we're looking at a UI kit or a UI library or a design system, we need to figure out what works for what we need for users and plan out what users need to do in the open source software project. And often, like I said, open source software projects aren't thinking about what users need to do as much as is this component available in the UI kit? So they're not, open source software projects are not planning out in sketches or wireframes what they want their users' steps to be, especially if the open source is not an app or a web interface. And let's look at this heuristic evaluation process to assess whether or not the existing UI in an open source software project meets the needs of users. So heuristic evaluation is a methodology and evaluation criteria depending on a certain list that you use. So heuristic evaluation have a number of different lists that you can use, and they're general principles for interaction design and UI design. And they're really useful as a guide to help you think through what an interface needs, what interface needs are and the issues are in certain interfaces, if there's any problems in those interfaces. And so they help you understand if the UI that you're looking at is understandable for users and whether the usability is good. So for this one, we're going to use the 10 usability heuristics for user interface design from Jakob Nielsen. I'm just going to find the link for that one here and drop it in the chat so that you all have access to that afterwards. But this is a really good design contribution for any open source software project is this heuristic evaluation to help better their design systems and extend their UI kits. So say we've got a open source software here. This is an open source software that I was involved in, which is about medical data for women, registering their medical information and medical data that then sends them notifications on when they need to go for appointments and when they need to update their medication. So I did a heuristic evaluation on this open source software project. So the first thing that I'm going to do is read the heuristic. So the design should always keep users informed about what's going on. So that's one of the heuristics. Actually, let's take a look at all of the heuristics in the heuristic evaluation before we focus on one of them. So let's just go here really quick. So here's 10 usability heuristics. So this first one here is visibility of system status. And then we have this one, which is the match between the system and the real world. And then number 3 is user control and freedom. So, and then all the way to number 10, there's a poster as well that you can get of these, all the way to number 10, which is help and documentation. And the heuristics give you information on what the heuristic helps users to do, and then some tips of how to assess that heuristic when you're looking at an interface. So let's go back here. So my heuristic is the first one, which is number 1, visibility of system status. So I'm looking at whether the design is keeping users informed about what's going on through appropriate feedback with reasonable time. And so here, I'm reading the heuristic, I'm looking at the UI, I'm asking myself a question: does this screen present enough information for a user to make a choice that they understand? And so here I'm using this guidance from the heuristic to make assessments based off of the elements of the UI. So the welcome message here is small and at the top, not at the top where I expect it to. So is the design keeping the user informed about what's going on? Well, it's keeping the user informed, but it's not the first thing that the user needs to see to keep informed. Here's a really critical one. I have a button that says sign up, but I don't know what's going to happen after sign up. So we're not keeping the user informed about what's going on. We're telling them that they're going to sign up, but what will happen after sign up? Do you need to immediately fill out some medical information? Do you immediately, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm asking myself these questions based off the heuristic. The next part of the process is I'm using the issues and recommendations template here. So just a column for issues and a column for recommendations. After I've gone through the heuristic, I'm making a list of what the issues are. So what are the things that break the heuristics rule? So where the design should always keep users informed about what's going on. Okay, the sign up button isn't keeping users informed about what's going on. So an issue here is the sign up doesn't say what to expect next. So I'm writing that down as this heuristic has an issue. There's an issue with this heuristic. Then I'm thinking about the recommendations. So in order to solve this heuristic that's broken, so the sign up doesn't say what to expect next, I should add some text about what happens next after the sign up button or near the sign up button. And so here you can see the difference when I've made the changes in the UI design based off of the heuristic. So this is the final part of a heuristic evaluation where you make changes based off of what you learn. But heuristic evaluation is just really good to go through the design system and element into finding the elements that need more that need extending in the design system. So the sign up button might be a UI element that doesn't contain this piece of text information underneath. And so the design system, the UI library, might need a new component which includes a button with text underneath like this, if it didn't have it already. So through this process of heuristic evaluation, I'm assessing whether or not the design elements, the components, have what is needed for the users. So again, I don't know really if we have time to go through a heuristic evaluation task, because I do believe I'm at like almost an hour now, and I think I was due to last an hour, but correct me if I'm wrong, if I have more time. But what I would recommend that you do, again, when you find the open source software project that you want to focus on for the issue translation, is after issue translation, taking the project through a heuristic evaluation process is a great next design. Oh yeah, sure. Do you want to give me a little bit of understanding of how much time I've got left?
Yes, actually. So it's designated for 7 to 9. So yeah, so you actually have like give or take 30 minutes, but it could be stretched, yeah.
Okay, cool. Have we got the ability to put people into breakout groups, or can we only stay in the main group?
At the moment, I don't really know how breakout works here. I haven't tried it. Okay, no, I can't. I won't be able to break out.
That's no problem. That's all good.
All right.
I think what I would like you all to do is I'd like you to pick one of the two exercises. So either the issue translation or the heuristic evaluation. Pick a heuristic evaluation, pick one of the 10 usability heuristics to focus on. I want you to find an open source project, and I'd recommend, again, you can look at the digital public goods, or you can take a look at any of the other open source projects that you might be able to find around on the internet. And I'd like you to pick one of these tasks, either the issue translation or the heuristic evaluation, and spend the next 10 minutes working on one of these exercises. You don't have to finish the exercise. In fact, you probably won't finish the exercise in 10 minutes, but I want you to start one of those exercises, and I'll put a 10-minute timer on so that we can have an alarm when the time is up. But I wanted to give you some time during this presentation so that you can practice the exercises and then ask any questions that you might have as you do them. If you want to ask me questions as you're trying to go through the exercises, please do. Let me know if you'd like any of the extra templates that are available, or if you'd like me to go back to, say, the 2 columns here for the heuristic evaluation, or again, take a look at the process, then yeah, you let me know whether you need any of the templates that I have. But really, for heuristic evaluation, you just need 2 columns and the open source software project open. Oh, and actually, I forgot one critical thing about a heuristic evaluation. You go page or section by page. So you don't try and do the heuristic evaluation for the entire application or the entire open source software. you do it for one section at a time. So you take a look at one page or one section of the open source software at a time. But yeah, let's put a timer on and see how people get on. Okay. So I see there's a general question in the chat as we've got a couple of minutes left. I hope folks that are trying out these exercises are having an okay time with them. Bear in mind, if they're new to you, these exercises, then, you know, it's always good to give them a try. Because, you know, you don't always know how to do something for the first time perfectly immediately, right? Like everyone learns and needs to take time. But these are all really, really good. These two things, the issue translation and the heuristic evaluation, are tried and tested methods and contributions for open source software as well. And they're also really good for commercial places as well. So places that are not open source software. But the question that's in the chat, as well as your previous question, I'll try and answer in the couple of minutes that we have before I continue. Is understanding Figma or Adobe necessary for a digital designer, and is there an open source alternative? Yes. So there are open source alternatives to pretty much everything that is commercial. So we've got Inkscape. Inkscape is a alternative to a free and open source alternative to Adobe Illustrator. So you can create vector graphics with it and other kinds of graphics. So Inkscape is really, really, look, it's also a drawing and art creation tool. So here's like an example of something that somebody's created in Inkscape. Actually, I wonder what other community galleries. So these are all examples of things that people have made in Inkscape, the tool. Wow, you can even do animations in Inkscape now as well. So that's an alternative to any commercial animation tools. So Inkscape is for vector graphics. So for people that want to create 3D art, there's Blender. Blender is actually really popular and used by a lot of commercial companies like animation companies and 3D art companies, but it's fully open source. So again, here's like some examples of the 3D art and the 3D assets that you can make in Blender. So we've got Inkscape, we've got Blender. For UI UX designers, we've got Penpot app. So Penpot is as you can kind of see from the main page, you can create UI designs. You can do pretty much everything that you would need to do in Figma or Adobe XD can be done in Penpot. You can also use it within the browser. In fact, you can have a desktop application for Penpot now, but it was created by a community member, an open source developer community member, and maintained by a community member. So it's not an official app created by the Penpot team. But you can also use Penpot in the browser as well. So it does require an internet connection. So it's a little bit harder to use Penpot when you haven't got like a connection to a browser or an internet connection. It also doesn't have a mobile app. So while Figma I think has a slightly like more advanced mobile app for doing design on as well. So that's for the UI UX designers in the room. And then we've also got for people that use Miro. Oh, we're going to run out of our timer. Let me just pause that because we don't need it anymore. For people that use tools like Miro and whiteboards for sticky notes, we've got Excalidraw. So this is an open source software, a free and open source software alternative to Miro. So again, it's like one of those things where you can, where even are they? You can create like sticky notes somewhere. I'm not quite sure actually where they are, but you've got frames, you've got images. Oh, and you can kind of create like boxes. You can also do wireframing in this as well. So this is again free and open source software. You can pay for some extended features on this, but it's also free and open source software as well. So a lot of open source software also will have like software as a service paid for services as well. And then there's another one. What's the last one? It's called GIMP. GIMP is another kind of art tool. It might be one that some people are familiar with, but it's an image editing software. So you can do things like editing photos. Again, you can create artworks in GIMP, and again, it's fully open source. It looks like they've linked to something else here as well. So Scribus looks like they're a publishing application. So this is a version of LibreOffice. So if you use Microsoft Word or Google Docs, and you want to use a alternative that's open source for text documents, if you're a user researcher, you can also use things like LibreOffice for documents. So again, fully free and open source software. You can create Excel spreadsheets, presentations, other things like that. Another alternative for this kind of documentation side of things, or creating research documents if you're a UX researcher, are things like Nextcloud is open source software, and you basically can save files and create lots of different kind of text documents and spreadsheets that you can share with different people. So there's lots of alternatives, open source software alternatives to the things that are paid for proprietary for designers. But if you're asking whether understanding Figma and Adobe is essential for being employed as a digital designer, it will depend on where you are looking for work. If you are looking for work in a commercial company that sells products, like that sells technology or has revenue, like profit making, and isn't an open source software organization, then they will probably want you to have familiarity with Figma or Adobe as well. But I think that is changing. So I think as long as you have design examples, I don't think a lot of places looking to hire now really care what you created it in, as long as you can create UI designs or graphic design. They're not going to say that your design is worse because you created it in open source software and not Adobe. It's kind of like a change in the culture. I'm going to finish, and then I'm going to address your question about AI generated codes and can they be open source software, because that's a really spicy question, but it's a great question. It's just a little spicy, so I'll save it for the end. Okay, let's continue. So I hope whoever attempted the exercises, I hope you had it was useful or interesting to do them, and I encourage you to contribute them to projects that you're interested in, or attempt to make that your first contribution as a designer to open source software. So a little bit of an example of the usability heuristic one here. They describe the usability heuristic one of the examples of what's the statement for usability heuristic one? The design should always keep users informed about what's going on. The examples that they use on the usability website are the "you are here" indicators on like a mall or maps that show people where they currently are and help them understand where they're going to go next. But also web UI, like when you have pricing sections and this outline shows the user where they are. So the user automatically knows that they have this selected and not this left hand, the middle section selected and not the left hand or the right hand section selected of this kind of component. So that's an example of your usability heuristic one, as well as on Medium and some other blogging platforms, when you highlight text, this kind of is an indication of showing a user where they are, and also showing a user what to do next and what they're going to do next with what they've interacted with. So this is also a good example of the giving users feedback immediately about where they are and what they're doing. This was the template that people can find, and if you do want to talk to other people about what you encountered in heuristics, then that would be really great. So I really want to talk a little bit about documentation and maintaining design as well as other aspects of open source software. So something about open source software that is critical, regardless of whether you're contributing code or whether you're contributing design or product management or whatever else you are helping an open source software project with, documentation is super important. It's essential. And especially in regards to design system maintenance and UI kit maintenance in open source. So it's also really important in regular design teams and technologies. Detailed documentation is how you understand how decisions were made and by who and why and with what user information. But I would say anytime you're creating design for open source software, whether it's graphics, whether it's branding, whether it's UI UX designs, make sure you're explaining and documenting how you're making your decisions and why. So if you've come up with a UI component that helps solve a problem, how did you discover the idea for that UI component? Did you look at examples from other products? How did you come to the conclusion? Because then that helps that people understand how you arrived at that result and conclusion. And it's just more clear. And then if another designer comes in and wants to also contribute, they can follow your process or add to your process. And it just makes everything more transparent and open and collaborative, rather than behind closed doors. So because open source software is created, distributed, created, and maintained globally. So most of the time, you're not going to be able to get on a call with people in open source software or meet them. And collaborating is about getting good at explaining, documenting, and handing over information. Even though you might not have somebody directly to hand over, the idea that you could be handing it over to anyone is essential in open source. So here's some examples from a project, an open source software project that I was involved in with many, many people all across the world. In fact, I think I've still got the Figma file open. Oh no, actually I don't, which is really bad. But I can maybe take a look at it in a little bit if people are curious. But there was about between 30 and 40 designers working on this open source project. And so as you can kind of see, we were working in Figma at the time because Penpot didn't have the features that we needed. So we were working on a free version of Figma. But you can see here, we've got lots of different pages. We've got an onboarding page, some user flows pages. We've got UI of the MVP, the minimum viable product. We've got documentation and shared knowledge, really important. More user flows and personas, style guides and components, which is what you can see here. And we had between 30 and 40 people working in this file at any given time, working on different parts of the UI design, working on the information architecture here, working on the user flows and user journeys here too. And you can kind of see the user flow and user journeys a little bit more detailed here. But imagine going to bed at night and then waking up and opening up your open source design file, and suddenly somebody's created this whole diagram, but they haven't explained what and why they did it. That can be really confusing. It can mean that you stop doing the work that you're doing until you can get answers from another person. They might have gone to sleep. But this is an example of a really well documented, really well structured project that worked, that many designers were contributing to. If you want to see more details from this project, I'm happy to share the link to the project as well, so that you can see it. Or you've got examples from CVS Health, which I believe is a US organization perhaps, but they've also created another Figma template about annotating web accessibility components. So how different components are annotated within a design file and why, and what kinds of parts of the web accessibility WCAG guide that they relate to. So this, if you search for this project online, you can, or if you search for it in Figma, you can find the Figma template for this one. And then the last thing that I kind of want to leave you with, which is an exercise, is Brad Frost created atomic design. That might be something that people are familiar with. The term atomic design was created by this front-end developer, I believe, or developer. I don't know how he defines himself now, but called Brad Frost. And he has a process called an interface inventory. So if heuristic evaluations feel too detailed or complex, you can start with an interface inventory for the design systems in UI Kit, which essentially is cataloging each of the UI elements that exist within a project already. And then you can see the inconsistencies once you've cataloged everything. So once you've taken screenshots of each of the button styles that are available in a project, you can then look at how you improve the design system in order to standardize and make all of the styles common. And then the last thing that I want to say before I say goodbye is, again, if they feel too complex heuristic evaluations and things like that, you've got also things in PenPot like design tokens, which sit very close to a code first versus a design first, or it's kind of interchangeable between code first and design first with design tokens. So I haven't used design tokens in much detail, but you can find out more information about design tokens on the PenPot website and how you can use them within the interface of PenPot. But essentially, design tokens here, you can set the values that are very close to how the values of, say, colors or text stylings or other elements of a design system, you can set how they're defined as coding language, but in the design tool, so in the design software, so inside PenPot. And it's worth having a look at how PenPot is evolving and working with their design tokens feature. But other than that, I just want to say thank you for listening, trying out the exercises if you did. Again, if you need access to the slides or any of the templates, you can find them. I can share the slides again, or I can share links. I'll also make sure that I share them with the folks at the Open Source Nest org as well to share out a little bit more. But you can also find me online on most social media platforms as Eriol Does Design, and you can always drop me DMs there. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on X, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on lots of different platforms. So if you've got any questions or you want to talk about anything, or if you would like access to things that I've shared, please let me know. Just to answer the question about AI generated codes for open source software, I think the short answer is yes, AI generated code can be open source software if you openly license it, but it's probably ethically and morally questionable depending on who you ask. And I'll kind of leave the answer to that question, at that spicy question at that. But with that, I think we're out of time. So I'll hand it back to the other folks to maybe close out.
All right. Thank you very much for this great section. Like, I learned a lot, and I also guess that everybody also learns a lot from the section. So please, if there are any questions, you can drop it on the chat, or you can raise your hand up and ask questions, right, for clarification. So please, like, question time. If you have any questions, please, like, raise your hand and ask your question. Okay, in absence of no question, right, I guess that everybody we learned a lot from the session, and we can also have you some other time, right? It's like a good section. Thank you very much. So I'll be handing the mic over to our host. Okay, someone just raised their hand. Do you have a question, Chinedu? If you do, just unmute your mic and ask your question.
All right, yeah. So my question is, I think she went over it, but I think I missed that part. How can we get access to these projects that are open sourced?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the most common place that you will find projects are going to be places like GitHub. I'll put the link in the chat. GitHub and GitLab are probably the biggest, what's called like software repositories, like code software repositories. So that's basically where code for open source software projects live. There are other alternatives that aren't GitHub or GitLab, but they can look a little more intimidating. So one example is, I'm going to put an example in the chat right now of a design task for that isn't hosted on GitHub or GitLab for a project, because it's on a different kind of code repository. But essentially, I think anyone starting out, start with GitHub and start with GitLab. You'll need to create a user. You'll need to create a profile on GitHub so that you can sign in. But if I just share my screen again really quickly, you will have access to like a search bar in GitHub. And here, what you can do is you can search for something that you're interested in. So you could search for, again, music. And here, basically, you'll get like too many results, right? Like 673K results. But you can check through some of these projects to see what they are and whether you would want to contribute to them. So you've kind of, let's see. So here's a Discord music bot for Discord. So maybe I'm interested in helping out the Discord music bot. How I would find out whether this is open source or not is I'm gonna make an assumption that most things on GitHub that you can see are going to be open source. And then the way that I would double check is I would check the license. Interesting. So this license isn't an open source license that I recognize. So this one isn't maybe as open source as other projects, in the sense that the license is quite an unusual one, but they do have a contributing page here. So they accept contributions and they accept people helping out. So it's okay that they don't have a license that I really understand or can that's familiar. But let's say for example, I find one of the projects that I work on. So let's say so this is the music project that I work on, Music Assistant. I'll show you what it looks like as well. 2 seconds. So this is Music Assistant. This is an open source software music player where you can bring in all of your different, if you've got like Spotify account, but also if you have some music files on your computer, it basically brings all of those systems in, and you can play music from different speakers and players. So if you've got multiple speakers around your house, you can play music from different speakers from this interface. So I don't have to play it on my computer. I can say, hey, can you play this track in the other room? But if I found that project, say I find that project on GitHub here, Music Assistant, then what I would be looking at is I would be looking for a project that has some tasks. So I can see that a lot of these projects maybe are a little confusing. Maybe I would take a look at the front end section here. I can see that there's some pull requests. I can see that there's a license again. So here they've got an Apache license. So this is a more common license. You can kind of see at the top here, it says that there are certain permissions, but there are certain things you can't do. But okay, this is a pretty standard open source license. And so I trust that this is open source because it's got a pretty common license that I can clearly see like has some rules associated with it. And then I would look for like contributing. Oh, it doesn't look like they've got a contributing document. But maybe at this point, I would be trying to use the tool or taking a look at the kind of other repositories to see, are there other tasks? Oh, but they've also got a project board over here in GitHub. And so if I can see the project board, if they've made it public, and hopefully they have, if they've made it open source, here I can see some of the tasks that the team are working on. And I would look through some of these tasks and see if there's something that I can work on. And you can kind of see here that for my own work here, I've created a UX task, and this is my UX to-do column, basically. But this should all be openly viewable. But essentially, the place to go to find open source projects to contribute to is either taking a search on GitHub, or you can search on Google, what are some good open source projects to contribute to? Often you can ask people, if you know people in open source, hey, do you know any projects that are looking for help right now? Oh, and then the really important one, which I should not forget, is open source design.net. So open source design.net, we have this jobs board, and these are all projects that are looking for design support. So you can see what they're looking for. So this place is looking for a logo design. And if I click here, I can find out all the different information about like what they're looking for this logo design. And then loads of other projects are still looking for help. But there's some multiple ways to find the projects. I hope that helps. I hope that gives you a good amount of options for finding projects. Cool.
All right, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much. We appreciate. Yeah, so I'll be handing the mic over to our host to round up the meeting. So thank you very much, ma. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me and listening.
Yes, the mic has been passed back to me. Eriol, thank you sincerely for everything. This was actually an insightful session. I know I'm not speaking alone, and I'm speaking on behalf of everybody here. When I say this is the first time I'm seeing, design being broken down properly in the open source ecosystem. And we really appreciate that you are part of our campaign, yes, to help demystify open source. Yes, that it's not just for developers, and every other person is also very much welcome. Yes. Your sessions have been recorded. If Google Meet does not fail me, yes. And I know whoever comes across this video later will definitely find it very, very like insightful. I'm not a designer myself, but at least I think I can raise my shoulder now when I'm speaking to other designers. I mean, I'm not so lost. But that's just it for now. That's just it for now. So guys, this was day one. Tomorrow we'll be having Unyaba Darlington, the head of design at Open Source Nest, walk us through the whole design combo and open source. That would be our last campaign, our last workshop for the year. So don't forget to tell your design friends, your buddies, your peers, people around you, just about this stuff. And we started strong and we're going to end it strong. Thank you once again, Eriol, for this whole experience. We sincerely appreciate your presence. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Yeah.
Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions, even if something I said wasn't and you didn't quite understand and you're like, hey Eriol, can you just say it again, and can you explain it again? I'm always very happy to have a call with people and explain things or chat about things. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
All right. Good day or good night, everyone, depending on your time zone. Bye and see you tomorrow.